have no doubt of it, I said. And then, said somebody else, then there was Petit Gaillard, who thought himself a pinch of snuff, and was truly distressed because he could not take himself between his own finger and thumb. And then there was Jules Dessolières, who was a very singular genius indeed, and went mad with the idea that he was a pumpkin. He persecuted the cook to make him up into pies, a thing which the cook indignantly refused to do. For my part, I am by no means sure that a pumpkin pie à la Dessolières would not have been a very capital eating indeed. You astonish me, said I, and I looked inquisitively at Monsieur Maillard. Ha, 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 said that gentleman. He, he, ho, ho, hoo, hoo, hoo. Very good indeed. You must not be astonished, mon ami. Our friend here is a wit, a droll. You must not understand him to the letter. And then, said some other one of the party, then there was Buffon Legrand, another extraordinary personage in his way. He grew deranged through love, and fancied himself possessed of two heads. One of these he maintained to be the head of Cicero, the other he imagined a composite one, being Demosthenes from the top of the forehead to the mouth, and Lord Brougham's from the mouth to the chin. It is not impossible that he was wrong, but he would have convinced you of his being in the right, for he was a man of great eloquence. He had an absolute passion for oratory, and could not refrain from display. For example, he used to leap upon the dinner table thus, and here a friend at the side of the speaker put a hand upon his shoulder and whispered a few words in his ear, upon which he ceased talking with great suddenness and sank back within his chair. And then, said the friend who had whispered, there was Bouillard, the teetotum. I call him the teetotum because, in fact, he was seized with the droll but not altogether irrational crochet that he had been converted into a teetotum. You would have roared with laughter to see him spin. He would turn round upon one heel by the hour in this manner, so. Here the friend whom he had just interrupted by a whisper performed an exactly similar office for himself. But then, cried an old lady at the top of her voice, your Monsieur Bouillard was a madman, and a very silly madman at best. For who, allow me to ask you, ever heard of a human teetotum? The thing is absurd. Madame Joyeuse was a more sensible person, as you know. She had a crochet, but it was instinct with common sense, and gave pleasure to all who had the honor of her acquaintance. She found upon mature deliberation that by some accident she had been turned into a chicken cock, but as such she behaved with propriety. She flapped her wings with prodigious effect, so, and as for her crow, it was delicious. Cock-a-doodle-doo, 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 doo, doo. Madame Joyeuse, I will thank you to behave yourself here, interrupted our host very angrily. You can either conduct yourself as a lady should do, or you can quit the table forthwith. Take your choice. The lady, whom I was much astonished to hear addressed as Madame Joyeuse, after the description of Madame Joyeuse she had just given, blushed up to her eyebrows, and seemed exceedingly abashed at the reproof. She hung down her head, and said not a syllable in reply. But another and younger lady resumed the theme. It was my beautiful girl of the little parlour. Oh, Madame Joyeuse was a fool, she exclaimed, but there was really much sound sense, after all, in the opinion of Eugénie Salsifette. She was a very beautiful and painfully modest young lady, who thought the ordinary mode of habiliment indecent, and wished to dress herself always by getting outside instead of inside of her clothes. It is a thing very easily done, after all. You have only to do so, and then so, and then so, and then, Mon Dieu, Mademoiselle Salsifette, here cried a dozen voices at once. What are you about? Forbear, that is sufficient. We see very plainly how it is done. Hold, hold! And several persons were already leaping from their seats to withhold Mademoiselle Salsifette from putting herself upon a par with the Medicean Venus, when the point was very effectually and suddenly accomplished by a series of loud screams or yells from some portion of the main body of the chateau. My nerves were very much affected indeed by these yells, but the rest of the company I really pitied. I never saw any set of reasonable people so thoroughly frightened in my life. They all grew as pale as so many corpses, and shrinking within their seats sat quivering and gibbering with terror, and listening for a repetition of the very sound. It came again, louder and seemingly nearer, and then a third time very loud, and then a fourth time with a vigor evidently diminished. At this apparent dying away of the noise, the spirits of the company were immediately regained, and all was life and anecdote as before. I now ventured to inquire the cause of the disturbance. A mere bagatelle, said Monsieur Millard. We are used to these things, and are really very little, and care really very little about them. The lunatics every now and then get up a howl in concert, one starting another, as is sometimes the case with a bevy of dogs at night. It occasionally happens, however, that the concerto yells are succeeded by a simultaneous effort at breaking loose, when, of course, some little danger is to be apprehended. And how many have you in charge? At present we have not more than 10 altogether, principally females, I presume? Oh, no, every one of them men, and stout fellows, too, I can tell you. Indeed, I have always understood that the majority of lunatics were of the gentler sex. It is generally so, but not always. Some time ago there were about 27 patients here, and of that number no less than 18 were women. But lately matters have changed very much, as you see. Yes, have changed very much, as you see, here interrupted the gentleman who had broken the shins of Mademoiselle Laplace. Yes, have changed very much, as you see, chimed in the whole company at once. Hold your tongues, every one of you, said my host, in a great rage, whereupon the whole company maintained a dead silence for nearly a minute. As for one lady, she obeyed Monsieur Millard to the letter, and thrusting out her tongue, which was an excessively long one, held it very resignedly with both hands until the end of the entertainment. And this gentlewoman, said I to Monsieur Millard, bending over and addressing him in a whisper, this good lady who has just spoken and who gives us the cock-a-doodle-doo, she, I presume, is harmless, quite harmless, eh? Harmless, ejaculated he in unfeigned surprise. Why, what can you mean? Only slightly touched, said I, touching my head. I take it for granted that she is not dangerously affected, eh? Mon Dieu, what is it you imagine? This lady, my particular old friend, Madame Joyeuse, is as absolutely sane as myself. She has her little eccentricities, to be sure, but then, you know, all very old women, are more or less eccentric. To be sure, said I, to be sure, and then the rest of these ladies and gentlemen are my friends and keepers, interrupted Monsieur Millard, drawing himself up with hauteur. My very good friends and assistants. What? All of them? I asked. The women and all? Assuredly, he said. We could not do at all without the women. They are the best lunatic nurses in the world. They have a way of their own, you know. Their bright eyes have a marvelous effect, something like the fascination of the snake, you know. To be sure, said I, to be sure. They behave a little odd, eh? They are a little queer, eh? Don't you think so? Odd. Queer. Why, do you really think so? We are not very prudish, to be sure, here in the South. Do pretty much as we please, enjoy life, and all that sort of thing, you know. To be sure, said I, to be sure. And then perhaps this Clos de Vougeot is a little heady, you know, a little strong. You understand, eh? To be sure, said I, to be sure. By the by, monsieur, did I understand you to say that the system you have adopted in place of the celebrated soothing system was one of very rigorous severity? By no means. Our confinement is necessarily close, but the treatment, the medical treatment, I mean, is rather agreeable to the patients than otherwise. And the new system is one of your own invention? Not altogether. Some portions of it are referable to Professor Tarr, of whom you have necessarily heard, and again there are modifications in my plan which I am happy to acknowledge as belonging of right to the celebrated Fether, with whom, if I mistake not, you have the honor of an intimate acquaintance. I am quite ashamed to confess, I replied, that I have never even heard the names of either gentleman before. Good heavens, ejaculated my host, drawing back his chair abruptly and uplifting his hands. I surely do not hear you aright. You did not intend to say, that you had never heard either of the learned Dr. Tarr or the celebrated Professor Fether? I am forced to acknowledge my ignorance, I replied. But the truth should be held inviolate above all things. Nevertheless, I feel humbled to the dust not to be acquainted with the works of these no doubt extraordinary men. I will seek out their writings forthwith, and peruse them with deliberate care. Monsieur Maillard, you have really, I must confess it, you have really made me ashamed of myself.